Assalamu alaikum, everybody. This week we are going to be discussing the topic of administrative reforms. This is part of week 12 according to our syllabus. The way I've structured this particular lecture is that in the first half of the lecture, we are going to be discussing some generic theoretical concepts related to administrative reforms. We are going to understand what administrative reforms are, what is the nature of these reforms, why do we need them. And in the second half of this particular lecture, we are going to be discussing how administrative reforms have been implemented in the case of Pakistan. So basically, I will be introducing you guys to some examples of reforms that have been introduced in our country. So let's begin. So, before we actually define what administrative reform is, what do you think? What is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of the term or the word reform? So, take a couple of seconds to think about it. So, I'm sure most of you must have considered this term or this word, which is associated with reform, is change, right? You want to bring about change whenever you hear this term reform, right? And some of you might actually think, why is there a need to bring about change? Why? Because you do not like the existing status quo, which is that you do not like things how they're happening in the current scenario, right? So that's the rationale for why you want to bring about change. You want to improve the quality of certain sectors, certain organization. So that's the rationale for you to bring about reform. So, how do we actually define administrative reform? So, let's go through a couple of definitions from literature which very nicely define what administrative reforms are. So, according to this definition by Wallace, administrative reform means an induced permanent improvement in administration, right? So let's try to break down this definition. What do we mean by induced? So you deliberately try to bring about certain change, certain improvement in your administration, right? And permanent, what do we mean by permanent? You want to bring about change which is going to be long lasting, right? And this word permanent is slightly contentious because in a bit, once I'll explain you the nature of reforms, you'll understand that no reform is actually permanent, because after the passage of a couple of years or after passage of a decade, you realize that you probably need to bring about more change in your work environment, in your public sector, given the circumstances in which you are operating, right? So this is one definition of administrative reform. So let's consider another one by Chapman and Greenway. According to them, administrative reform is a process of change, right? So we already discussed this term change. And this is change which is brought about in administrative structures, right? Structures means the way your organizations are actually, designed. You want to bring about change in these structures. And procedures within the public services. What do we mean by procedures? How things get done in a public sector, right? And why is there a need to bring about this change? Because they have become out of line with the expectations of the social and political environment. So, what this means is, according to this definition, you want to initiate a process of reform because the current status quo or the current scenario in which you're operating or the current methods that you are using to deliver your public services are no longer valid or are no longer in line with the expectations of your social and political environment, right? So we are going to just talk a little about this social and political environment when we discuss why reforms need to be initiated, right? So we'll explore it in a bit. Let's move on. So, what is the nature of administrative reforms? First of all, it's important for you to understand that these are deliberate, intentional social actions premeditated by administrative reforms. What this means is that reforms never happen out of thin air, right? Somebody has to plan. This premeditated word symbolizes that somebody has to plan a set of reforms. They have to make this conscious decision that we want to change our organizations, we want to bring about, improvements in our administrative systems. So please bear this in mind, that these are deliberate, conscious social actions, right? They do not happen in an unconscious manner. Another feature of administrative reforms is that they can be an economic process, right? How can they be an economic process? Administrative reforms actually may distribute your resources and alter the end product, right? So let's say, for instance, I can give you an example that in a country where there's a lot of income inequality, or whereby there's a lot of corruption, for instance, right? So we know the drawbacks or the sort of consequences of corruption on the way transactions happen in your public sector, right? So if a government decides to bring about corruption reforms, essentially they want to make the entire sort of economic system more transparent. And the idea is that now you're going to be redistributing resources in an equitable manner. Similarly, through corruption, it's quite likely that the end product, or the end results, or the user services that you provide are not up to the mark, because at the back door there's a lot of bribing happening, or a lot of compromises on quality is happening. But once you bring in these reforms, the idea is that after the initiation of these reforms, you're actually improving your services, you're improving the public service products that you're providing to your citizens, right? So another sort of feature of these reforms is that it's a psychological process, right? So what do we mean by a psychological process? That sometimes you bring about changes in your organization so that you can alter or you can change behavioral patterns, beliefs of your employees, their attitudes, and their individual actions, right? So, another example of this psychological process can be that, for instance, in our previous lectures, we have discussed this quite a bit, that generally, bureaucracy is associated with a lot of red tape, with a lot of inefficiency. And the idea is that it's very difficult to get things done, right? So there's a lot of delay in terms of processing your services. So and this particular sort of structure or procedure sort of impacts the way your employees work as well. Like generally, it's said that the employee behavior of people working in the public sector tends to be very, lax, and they're not very keen to proactively take up issues. So, if you bring about a set of administrative reforms which sort of seek to change the behavior of individuals, which try to make them more resistant to change, which try to make them more adaptable, so that's also part of your administrative reforms. So, this point basically shows that reforms do not necessarily have to be associated with just bringing about economic changes or the way you redistribute resources, but rather they can actually entail a behavioral or a psychological change among your employees working in the organization. So, another feature of or sort of nature of administrative reform is that these reforms are implemented or executed through an established administrative system which is transformed in some way. So, this is important. This particular point signifies that your reform has to come from the agency or from a government apparatus which wants to bring about change in that particular sector, right? So let's say we want to reform the public sector, even though, let's say, the private sector is unhappy with the way public sector works, and whenever they are interacting with the public sector, they face a lot of impediments, for instance, for their work. So the issue is that the private sector, even though it's not happy with the way public sector is working, it cannot bring about changes in the public sector. So the public sector itself has to realize that its machinery or its procedures are out of date, so they need to bring about this change in their services, in their organizations, right? Another feature or aspect or nature of administrative reforms is that the people who are originating this reform, or the people who are sort of designing this reform process, do not necessarily need to be part of an administrative system, right? What this essentially means is that a lot of times countries of the world, not just in Pakistan, if they want to reform a certain sector, they want to improve it a little more, what they tend to do is they hire some consultants which are not working in the public sector. And the idea for having these sort of third party consultants or unbiased consultants is that these guys can come in your public sector and actually provide input, from an outsider's perspective, because naturally outsiders are in a better position to judge the inefficiencies in your system, because somebody who is already part of the system, he doesn't maybe realize that an existing process or an existing procedure is really inefficient, right? So this particular feature means that, which is linked to the this third feature, that even though the impetus or sort of this reform process needs to be started from a government agency, however, people who design this reform do not necessarily have to be people from the government. The government can actually hire any private parties or experts in the field to change a certain organization, their structure, procedures, etc. Right? So let's move on to another feature. So, another key sort of aspect which is associated with administrative reforms is that oftentimes, once you sort of initiate this reform process, successful reforms actually sort of bring about or set in motion a whole series of chain events that lead to other kinds of reforms as well, right? So, what happens is that, let's say you try to reform one particular sector. So, for instance, you try to reform the health sector. So, anybody which is associated with the health sector would also realize that we need to overhaul our system as well, right? So, for instance, if you want to change the way you procure health related equipment from the industry, right? So maybe you're tightening procurement rules for your organization, right? So let's say the health sector actually gets or procures these equipments from the private sector. So now the private sector also has to be a little more sort of keen to adopting these new changes whenever they are interacting with the public health sector. So the idea is that once you initiate this reform process, they can actually bring about more positive change in other sectors as well, or in other organizations as well. And once this cycle of reforms basically starts, this can actually indicate that you probably need more administrative reforms in the area that you started with, right? So, what does this particular feature tell you? It basically tells you that reform is a constant sort of struggle for looking for improvements in your public sector. So, you can't really say that if you have reformed a sector this year, 10 years or 20 years down the road, you wouldn't have to change it more. No, but rather you will have to improve this particular system even more at the later stage as well, right? So let's move on. So now let's discuss some drivers of administrative reforms, which means why do we need administrative reforms? What are some things or factors which set into motion these reforms that need to be brought about in the public sector? So I've divided these reforms into two influences, so internal influence and external influence. So we'll discuss them one by one. Let's begin with internal influence. So, internal influences are basically influences which are necessitated or which originate from your own country, right? So, an example could be that you realize that you want to reform your country as a result of some domestic economic crisis, for instance, right? So, examples of economic crisis could be that the example of 2008 economic recession that happened around the world. And after this recession, a lot of countries of the world sort of brought about massive changes in the way their economies were structured. They actually increased a lot of, you can say, measures around ensuring transparency in business transactions, for instance. They brought about a lot of reforms in terms of, providing stimulus packages to the economy, so so that the economies can actually kickstart. So this could be one of the reasons that a disaster or an economic crisis takes place in your country, and as a result, in order to sort of fix this crisis, you take certain steps to overcome this particular issue. Another influence could be that your country naturally just wants to modernize administrative systems. And why is there a need to modernize your public sector or your administrative systems? Because you want to better manage problems associated with a lot of factors. So, what could be some factors which necessitate the modernization of your public sector? So, let's go through these one by one. First of all, changing social values, right? So, that could be a key reason why you would want to change certain sort of mechanisms in your country, right? So, just giving you an example that back in 1800s, slavery was considered totally legal. It was okay to engage in slave trading, for instance. However, you saw that over time there was this consensus built around the world that slavery needs to be abolished, right? So your social values changed from, binding humans and treating them as slaves to sort of realizing that no individuals, no humans can actually be chained, and you cannot actually treat them as commodities, right? So this could be one example of how over the years your social values changed, and you basically abolished or outlawed an altogether phenomena which was considered legitimate back in the day, right? So how is it linked to your administrative systems? Administrative systems which previously, for instance, allowed the practice of slavery would have to institute laws or legal reforms that would outlaw or that would bar the practice of slavery. Similarly, another good example of changing social values could be that back in the day, especially if you take the example of the US, racial minorities or women were not allowed to vote or to participate in electoral processes, right? Because of the idea was that, women should not be allowed to voice their opinions in political matters. However, we saw that over time, this particular phenomena or the way women were viewed, the way their rights were viewed, it was massively changed, and now it's a political reality that everybody, irrespective of their gender, irrespective of their ethnicity, are guaranteed this right to vote, right? So this is a good example of how your changing social values enable or sort of bring about certain reforms that are necessary to modernize your country. Similarly, another sort of change which has been associated with administrative reforms is that growing urbanization in countries around the world has actually necessitated that now you provide public services which are sort of catering to the need of the urban class, right? So, if most of your country was based on a rural agrarian society, naturally your government would provide a different set of services. However, if there's greater urbanization in society, you will have to cater to this growing sort of urbanization and the needs of the citizens. Similarly, another driver for administrative reforms is that in certain countries of the world, if there's a lot of conflict among some of the key ethnic groups within your country, you'll have to mitigate this conflict by coming up with institutions that can sort of maybe ensure greater harmony between these groups, or to ensure that further conflicts are not aggravated between these groups, right? So a good example could be that I don't know if you guys know this, but in Sri Lanka for the longest time there was a civil war which was happening between this sort of terrorist group, the Tamil Tigers, and the main ethnic group of Sri Lankan population. So the government had to deal this conflict between the Tamil Tigers and the other population, right? So they had to bring about certain mechanisms to ensure safety of these groups, to ensure sort of stability in their political affairs. Another driver could be increasing industrialization in your society, right? So, again, going back to this example of if previously your economy was largely based on an agrarian economic systems, naturally your government would have to provide a different set of sort of structures or procedures to the individuals, and even the revenue collection, for example, mechanism of the government would be different. However, if you move to greater industrialization, whereby there's mass production of goods and services, there the government would probably have to modernize itself. For instance, it would have to change its strategy in the way they collect and administer revenues or taxes on the individuals, right? Another key driver, which is associated or which can be considered as an internal influence of administrative reform, is your changing political ideologies, right? So, an excellent example of this particular phenomena could be from the case of Pakistan. So, let's say back in the day, in early 2000s, up till early 2000s, we were totally okay with dictatorships, for instance. We were okay with authoritarian rule, right? But over time, we saw that there has become quite a bit of resistance against authoritarianism. And as a society, I would argue, you can actually disagree with me, that we have probably become a little more democratic, and we probably do not sort of allow as much, or we probably would resist authoritarian rule now, right? And there could be could be multiple factors associated with this change in political ideologies, because of greater press freedom, for instance, an active role of civil society. So these actors have actually become really sort of proactive in terms of ensuring that our civil liberties are ensured, we are provided our rights, and probably they wouldn't leave any room for authoritarianism to actually take its root in Pakistan. So these are just some examples of how these factors actually bring about or sort of initiate this reform process in countries around the world. So now let's move on to some external influences, right? So, what are these external influences? These are factors or drivers which come from abroad, and they try to sort of necessitate or they try to sort of influence the way the reform process is happening in your country. So, what are some examples? So, globalization, I'm sure all of you know this by now. Globalization has really sort of, you can say, facilitated or helped out in the diffusion of new ideas and norms around the world, right? So we know that now that we are connected to the world, anything which happens in our neighboring country or even in Europe or the US for that matter. So these influences, since we have so much reach to, or so much sort of connectivity with these regions of the world, that we are unintentionally sort of influenced by whatever developments which are happening outside of our country. So this globalization has actually encouraged sort of greater adoption of certain administrative reforms as well. And one really good example of globalization is, remember we discussed this concept of new public management, right? So these were set of reforms which were introduced way back in 80s in Australia, New Zealand, in the UK as well. And as a result of this sort of interconnectedness between the world, among different countries of the world, this particular reform idea was adopted by multiple countries around the world. And even the developing world started adopting this idea of privatization, greater efficiency in public services etc. Right? So, another key sort of external influence for bringing about administrative reform could be that a country wants to be perceived in favorable light for international investment and trade in the global marketplace, right? So, as a country, if you want to do well, the idea is that you want to bring about changes in your economic structure so that you can attract greater investment in your country. Another good example of this particular influence could be that, for instance, when Prime Minister Imran Khan came to power, he talked quite a lot about how he wants to sort of bring about greater ease of doing business, so that they can attract a lot of investments from outside. So, in terms of ease of doing business, he basically said that he would cut red tape, he would encourage his businesses to set up, their structures more easily, and he would drive out corruption. So, all of these sort of mechanisms were put in place to ensure that you are able to attract international investors in your country, which are ultimately going to bring about sort of a greater economic benefit in your region. Another key sort of external influence for bringing about administrative reforms around the world is that certain international institutions and some regulatory agencies, they have actually provided this conditional funding to certain countries of the world, right? Another example could be that, for instance, whenever we go to IMF for a loan, right? Because naturally we need money, right? So whenever you go to IMF, they, in return of the loan, they would want you to bring about certain changes in your own country. They would want you to, bring about economic reforms in terms of increasing your revenue sources, in terms of reducing subsidies, for instance, on the power sector, right? So, certain institutions, in return for the funding that they provide to country, they sort of mandate or they require countries to follow certain reform strategies. Some other examples could be some UN agencies which provide funding to countries, especially developing countries of the world. So, if you get funding from, for instance, UNDP, UN Development Program, in areas related to, let's say, women empowerment, say, so they would want the government to actually bring about certain reforms related to women empowerment. So this slide basically sort of, I think, very nicely try to capture all the drivers of administrative reforms, and we try to understand it with some examples as well. So let's move on. So, very briefly, I would want to sort of walk you through some of the reform strategies which are used by countries around the world, right? So, the question is, you realize that there's a need of reform. So, how do you bring about this reform, or which areas can you tap in terms of bringing about reform strategies? Please bear this in mind. These strategies, which are sort of taken from Tamer and Hummel, these are just some sort of ways in which you can bring about change in administrative systems. However, there are more strategies as well, right? So, for the purpose of this particular lecture, we are just going to focus on these ones. So, one of the key strategy which is used by public organizations is restructuring, right? So, what do we mean by restructuring? You basically just simply change the structure of your organization, you redesign this structure. And the reason for sort of redesigning the structure is that you want to improve organizational effectiveness and efficiency, right? So, how do you do that? You try to eliminate red tape. We have, I think, talked about red tape quite a bit previously as well. By red tape, we mean inefficiency. We mean that if, let's say, you want to get a business license from a public organization, if it takes you 25 steps to take this license, if you want to sort of reduce this red tape or reduce this inefficiency, you would reduce the number of steps from 25 to, let's say, to just 10 steps, right? So this is one way of sort of speeding up the process of getting things done. Another sort of element which could come under restructuring is that you downsize your organization. What does that mean? That generally public organizations tend to be overstaffed. What that means is that you have a lot of people doing very less work, actually, right? So there's a lot of redundancy in the types of tasks which are performed by employees working in the public sector. So in order to sort of ensure cost effectiveness in your organization, in order to cut cost in your public sector institution, what you essentially do is you lay off or you reduce the number of employees working in your organization. Another sort of way of restructuring is decentralizing authority. What that means is that it's decentralizing, as you can understand, is the opposite of centralization of power. So, whenever you are decentralizing authority, it means that you're empowering people working at the lower level of your organization to take, actions more proactively, and you are basically empowering them to work more effectively, right? So this decentralization of authority is actually a hallmark of the private sector, and one of the reasons why greater innovation happens in the private sector is because you have empowered your teams, your lower level managers, etc., as opposed to greater centralization. Similarly, another sort of feature which could be adopted by organizations could be that they would want to improve organizational responsiveness. What that means is, if you remember, responsiveness is basically fulfilling the needs and wishes of your customers or your citizens, right? So, if some complaint comes in your region, so greater responsiveness would be that you would want to quickly bring about quickly would want to resolve these complaints. So a good example of this improving organizational responsiveness feature could be that Prime Minister Imran Khan came up with the citizens portal, and the idea for sort of coming up with this particular app was that if I face, let's say, a complaint related to my electricity or my gas utility bill, right? So I can just go to this Citizens Portal app, lodge my complaint, and it's going to be directed to the concerned official, right? And then the idea is that they would get back to me and provide relief to my complaint, right? So, another sort of feature which would come under administrative reform strategy would be to improve greater participation in the policy making process. What does that mean? That you do not make the policy making process just top down in nature, but you rather try to include the opinion of communities as well, local citizens as well. You try to ensure that the local people also have a voice in the ways services are delivered to them. And again, this particular reform has been associated quite a lot with European countries of the world, which try to empower local communities in terms of resolving their own issues, right? Another sort of feature or another strategy that the organizations can use is that they can solve human resource issues. Again, there could be multiple human resource issues that can be solved by a public organization. For instance, if you're a public organization which is facing a sort of a demotivated workforce, right? People do not, for instance, come to work on time. People are not interested in the work that they do. They are not very productive. So you try to bring about reforms to alter their behavior, right? To change their attitudes, to make them more efficient, to make them more productive. You think about, can you provide greater perks to these individuals? You can maybe sort of improve their salaries, for instance, right? So all of these human resource or personnel management related issues can also be sort of taken up by public organizations as a reform strategy. Another feature or strategy which could be adopted is related to accountability. So, you want to ensure sort of greater transparency in your public sort of processes. And this accountability can be, related to again your public personnel management systems, human resource systems, or generally the way resources are distributed in your economy, for instance, right? So you can bring about like a set of anti-corruption laws, strategies to ensure greater transparency and accountability of public officials. That could be another set of reform strategies. And sort of the fifth strategy, which is proposed by Turnell and Hummel, is that you can actually devise novel ways of providing public services. So, how do you devise that? You have a mix of public private partnerships, and here what you do is that public sector solely does not provide goods and services, but rather you partner with the private sector and they help you in terms of providing services as well, right? Another feature could be that you privatize public enterprises altogether, and the reason for that is that you want to improve productivity in your organization. So let's move on. Let's discuss some of the international trends in administrative reforms, which essentially means is that these trends have been followed by different countries of the world. And this is how these are certain things that have been adopted around the world, may it be like the developed world or the developing countries. So let's go through these one by one. So, a key trend that has been observed worldwide is the change in structure, right, of organization. So, as previously mentioned, a lot of countries around the world have actually promoted greater decentralization of authority. And part of the reason why greater decentralization of authority has been promoted is because you have seen the emergence of certain supranational organization or the emergence of international organizations, right? So, what is an example of a supranational entity or a supranational setup? So, European Union is an excellent example of supranationalism, supranational governance mechanisms. So, here what happens is that you have the EU policy making at the EU level, and in certain policy matters, for instance, the EU gets to make all the policy. Then the member states of the EU, for instance, have to sort of abide by this policy matter. Then certain areas are given to the national governments in which they can legislate matters. And then again, from the EU level, there's greater expectation that national governments will actually empower, subnational units, for instance, provinces, states, local communities, local councils, etc. Right? So there has been this growing trend, which has been sort of put forward by different international and supranational organizations, is that you need to concentrate power at the lowest level. You need to give power at the grassroots level in order to bring about sort of change or greater economic prosperity at the lower level, right? So there has been one trend. Another trend in terms of administrative reforms has been the marketization of public services. And if you guys remember, when we were discussing new public management and some sort of recent concepts related to public administration, we saw that there has been a greater emphasis on privatization, on contracting out public services to the private sector, and there has been actually a greater emphasis on ensuring that the public sector and the private sector work in partnership in order to bring about sort of prosperity or development in countries around the world, right? So this is sort of another key trend which has been sort of adopted by countries around the world, irrespective of the fact whether they are a country which is economically doing well uh, uh, or even not doing that well. And there has been some issues sort of related with greater marketization as well, is, or you can say some unintended consequences. There has been this use of or sort of appearance of clientelism. Clientelism is more or less related to patronage, and this means is that whenever you are sort of trying to reach a sort of agreement with the private sector, Due to lack of transparency, certain public sector officials may actually encourage their family or members of their kin to sort of engage in these services, right? So that gives rise to clientelism or favoritism. Similarly, it also brings about localized inequalities because greater privatization. We saw that one of the issue with sort of letting the private sector deal in the market is that the private sector does not think about externalities, and you need the government apparatus to sort of intervene in the government to uh, fix these income inequalities, right? So another issue could be unethical administrative behaviors. There could be a range of administrative behaviors that have appeared as a result of these greater marketization. For instance, greater bribery, kickbacks, sort of a lot of procurement scandals, etc. Right? So this is one of the trends. Another trend related to administrative reforms has been this rapid adoption of technology. So, technology has been used to sort of improve or to promote transparency and accountability in governance. And the sort of best manifestation of the use of technology has been the implementation of e-government mechanisms. And what is e-government? Simply, ensuring that you are providing public services through using technological tools to deliver services, to support operations, to interact with citizens, etc. So again, example could be the citizens portal app that was recently developed by Prime Minister Imran Khan's office. Then recently, I don't know if you guys are aware, but in ICT, which is Islamabad Capital Territory as well, a new app has also been launched as well, and the good thing about this particular app is that you can log in and get like a couple of things done there. So it's like a one-stop shop essentially, right? So if you need a driver's license, you can apply there. If you need a police certificate, you can apply there, etc. Right? So another trend related to administrative reforms has been associated with the way civil society sort of has become active in society. So now you don't just have the public sector or the private sector to provide services, but rather you have a lot of non-profit and voluntary organizations which are directly involved in production and provision of public goods and services. So you have a lot of NGOs which are essentially sort of providing goods and services which should be essentially provided by the public sector. They have been involved in a lot of development initiatives related to promoting democracy in terms of empowering women, providing rights to minorities, ethnic groups, etc. Right? So these were just some of the international trends in terms of administrative reforms. So let's move on. So, we have basically concluded the generic theoretical concepts related to administrative reforms. Now, we are going to discuss some examples of administrative reforms in the case of Pakistan, right? So, very briefly, I'll walk you through sort of the trajectory of administrative reforms in Pakistan. And then we are going to take just a few examples of administrative reforms in Pakistan. These examples are related to civil service reforms, some decentralization reforms, some accountability reforms, right? So we want to spend a bit of time understanding some of the key reforms which have been happening in Pakistan. But before that, just to let you guys know that over the past around 60 plus years, there have been more than 20 studies of administrative reforms in which multiple problems related to the public sector have been identified, have been sort of jotted down. And various over the years, various governments or various, entities basically promoted that a reform process should be initiated. Various reports and committees were commissioned for reorganization of functions and structures of the federal government, and there were multiple reforms which were brought about in terms of civil services reforms, decentralization reforms, etc. However, the sad part of all of this reform effort is that there has been very limited effort in terms of actually implementing these reforms. So, a lot of studies have been written, a lot of effort has been dedicated to sort of understanding our governance mechanism in terms of providing suggestions for improvements. However, there has been very limited sort of actual action related to implementing these improvements, right? And there are multiple reasons for why there has been limited sort of execution of these reforms. Some could be, a lot of political interference, a lot of political and economic stability. A lot of times, one government would come up with a set of reforms, the other government would just scrap all of these reforms and come up with some new strategies. And you saw that in the 90s and before, there was a lot of instability related to our political rule as well. Similarly, there has been ineffective planning as well. The planning efforts weren't that well. And lastly, there has been a lot of resistance from the civil services as well, because naturally, why would the bureaucracy want to change things, right? They would want things to stay as it is. So, these are some of the reasons why, unfortunately, the reform efforts in Pakistan haven't been that successful. However, despite that, I don't want to paint a gloomy picture. There are still some reform strategies which have been implemented and which were actually quite successful. So, we'll discuss this in the upcoming slides. First of all, let's start with the civil service reforms which have been implemented in Pakistan. So there have been numerous attempts to reform the civil services since the creation of Pakistan in 1947. And since 1947, numerous committees have been formed, and numerous external consultants were actually designated this task to sort of restructure and reform the civil services to make it more effective and to make it more efficient. So rather than going through all of these committees and reports regarding civil services reforms, for the purpose of this lecture, I have only picked two reforms which are quite important. So, first of all, we are going to go through reforms proposed during Prime Minister Bhutto's time period, Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. These reforms were proposed as part of this administrative reform committees in 1972, and they were later implemented in 1973. Similarly, another set of reforms which completely sort of wanted to overhaul the civil services of Pakistan was the set of reforms called the National Commission for Government Reforms. These reforms were actually proposed during General Pervez Musharraf's time period in 2006. So the idea is that one by one, we are going to explore some of the key elements of these reforms. So let's start with the reforms proposed by the Administrative Reforms Committee of 1972. So again, this particular committee proposed quite a number of reforms in the area of civil administration, in the area of restructuring public sector. So for this particular lecture, we are only going to talk about some major contributions of this committee. So, first of all, a key aspect of this reform process was that they basically proposed to replace the CSP cadre, which is the Civil Services of Pakistan cadre, by a new group called District Management Group and the Secretariat Group, in which all occupational groups would be represented, right? So, if you guys remember, I told you that prior to 1973, we were actually adopting the model which was actually implemented prior to partition as well, right? There was the Indian Civil Service, there was the Indian Police Service. So, more or less, Pakistan, when it was established, it actually followed the same model. So, it had the civil services of Pakistan, the police services of Pakistan, right? But this particular model was altogether, you can say, abolished by the reforms which were proposed by this committee. And now the CSP cadre was sort of eradicated, and you had this new cadre called District Management Group as well as the Secretariat Group. So I've already talked about the Secretariat Group before as well, the lecture on civil services of Pakistan. So Secretariat Group basically contains all occupational groups more or less, right? Additionally, another sort of change or reform which was proposed by this committee was that now there's going to be a unified service structure with different occupational groups, right? So, again, if you remember our lecture from Civil Services of Pakistan, I told you that previously there were four classes of civil services. So you had class 1 up till class 4, and these classes basically used to represent the different rank or the different grade of civil servants. However, this class system, which was inherited from the British time period, was actually abolished, and now we have this unified service structure. And if you guys remember from our Civil Services of Pakistan lecture, this unified service structure included the federal unified grading structure and the all Pakistan unified grade structure, right? So if you guys don't remember it, please go back to our lecture on civil services of Pakistan to explore what exactly these two grading structures are, right? So another key element which is linked to the first one was that now through this reforms committee, this national pay scale, which is the basic pay scale from grade 1 to 22, was actually proposed, which was essentially in place of the class 1 to 4 system, which was eradicated, or which was proposed to be eradicated by this particular committee. Another sort of key feature which had a lot of impact on the way civil services were actually carried out was this removal of constitutional safeguards against the dismissal, reduction in rank, or compulsory retirement of civil servants, right? So I think I've mentioned this quite a few times in the past as well, that generally civil services around the world is considered to be lifelong employment, right? So once you become part of the civil service, you tend to sort of complete the whole duration of your services until your retirement comes in place. And part of the reason why you have this lifelong employment is because the constitution actually safeguards against arbitrary dismissals, or against demotion, which is basically reduction in rank, or basically compulsory retirement of civil servants. However, please remember this when we were discussing the grievance and complaint mechanisms in the civil services of Pakistan. These provisions were sort of still in place, would still be in place if you're found doing some sort of misconduct within your civil services, or if you're violating the code of conduct of your civil services, right? So the idea is that you can be dismissed if you are found to be violated the code of conduct of your civil services. However, your constitution safeguards that you cannot arbitrarily, on the wishes and whims of the politicians, the politicians cannot dismiss you from the services, right? However, as a result of this sort of reforms committee, they propose that you need to remove these constitutional guarantees. And if you read between the lines, what this essentially means is that you're actually empowering politicians to sort of take up a proactive role, or to sort of pull the strings behind the work of civil services, right? And try to understand the context from which this particular feature was being proposed. So, prior to Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's government, you had military dictatorships, right? So, you had President Ayub's tenure before elections were held, which elected Prime Minister Bhutto. And one of the reasons why why Ayub Khan's government did well was because he majorly sort of took help from the civil services. And during Ayub's time period, civil servants were empowered quite a lot, right? And also, if you remember, I told you guys when I was explaining the history of the bureaucracy, I told you that right from the formative phase of Pakistan, right from the sort of creation of Pakistan, civil services played a key role in the way policies were made in Pakistan, right? So Bhutto, who was back then, a civilian politician, through these reforms, he tried to sort of, cut down the power or cut down the authority which was which was actually enjoyed by civil servants. So this is just one way to ensure that. So, another feature that was sort of introduced in the Administrative Reforms Committee was that this committee proposed the introduction of lateral recruitment program. Another word for this lateral recruitment program is lateral entry. So, what that essentially means is that through this reform proposal, now the private sector individuals could actually now become part of the civil services as well, right? Currently what happens is that if you are part of the civil services, you can only become part of the this public sector once you take the CSS exams, right? So I enter the civil services, let's say at grade 17, and nobody else who has sort of already passed or exceeded the age limit of CSS exam can no longer actually uh, come or join the civil services, right? However, if you are a civil services or you have actually adopted the system of lateral recruitment, what happens is that at grade 18 or grade 19 or grade 20, you can actually have somebody from outside the public sector, from academia, from some NGO or from some development sector or some other industry expert who can actually become part of the civil services, right? And through lateral entry, what essentially happens is that you try to take expertise from the private sector. You take expertise from people who are skilled in their jobs or in their portfolios, right? So again, this particular sort of feature sort of undermined the power of civil services, because now civil servants are going to be sort of competing with not just their own batchmates, but rather for future promotions they would be competing from from competing with outsiders from the industry as well. Because imagine that if you have been serving in civil services for good 10-15 years, and all of a sudden somebody else who has been working in another sector gets to sort of hold or compete for the same position, so that sort of damages the morale of the civil servants as well, right? So this is another sort of proposal which was introduced, which was proposed by this committee, and it actually did get implemented during Bhutto's time period. However, once we had the military dictatorship of President Ziaul Haq, the first thing that president did was that he reversed this policy of lateral recruitment, right? So another sort of key feature or reform proposal which was given by this Administrative Reforms Committee was the introduction of a common training program for all federal services, right? So we have already talked about this common training program in the civil services of Pakistan. So just to reiterate that this CTP was introduced by this Administrative Reforms Committee. Now the question is that since these were all the reforms proposals, right? Now the question is, what was the extent to which these reforms were actually implemented? So interestingly, all of these reforms have been implemented, and they're still actually in place. So more or less, with slight variations, more or less, we still have these reforms. However, some sort of key changes have been that this district management group is no longer called DMG group. It's called or renamed as Pakistan Administrative Services Group. Another sort of change that has happened is this feature of removal of constitutional safeguards. So this was actually later on removed as well in order to empower the civil services, and the system of lateral recruitment has been reversed as well. So it's no longer in place currently. And interestingly, just to let you guys know some current development, right, when the Prime Minister Imran Khan came into power, one of his promises was that he wants to sort of reform the civil services. And one of the key proposal of sort of reforming the civil services was actually to bring back this notion of lateral entry by actually hiring experts from outside the public services. However, I mean, there's just has been debate on this particular reform proposal, but there hasn't been actually any concrete action on it. Right. So these were the reforms proposed and implemented during Bhutto's time period. Let's move on to sort of analyzing these reforms. So, what are some of the advantages and sort of disadvantages of these reforms? So, first of all, a major sort of pro or an advantage of this reform was that they established the supremacy of the political leaders on the policy process, right? So, when I was explaining you guys the key players of the policy making process, I shared with you that civil servants and the army has been playing a key role in the way policies have been formulated in Pakistan. So this was the chance for politicians to actually sort of cut down or sort of curtail the power of civil services and to actually take hold of the policy process by making the politicians more sort of empowered, right? Another sort of advantage was that it reduced the size of bureaucracy. So, Prime Minister Bhutto actually let go of a lot of civil servants, which created a lot of, sort of bad feelings between the bureaucracy and the politician. So, the idea of reducing the size of bureaucracy was to make bureaucracy more efficient by sort of cutting down the number of employees who are working in the public sector. Another pro was that I was just explaining was this advantage of having lateral entry. And naturally, in your civil services, it makes sense to have people with specialized skill. For example, if you're somebody who's working in the Ministry of Science and Technology, it would make sense that somebody who has a background in science and technology comes and, heads or make key policies or decisions related to this ministry, as opposed to somebody who's a generalist, promoted, through the ranks of CSS, who doesn't have a background in science and technology. And if he makes the decisions, naturally, those decisions probably are not going to have as much specialized knowledge as somebody who has the skills and knowledge in this particular field, right? Now, what were some of the disadvantages of this particular committee and the reforms which were proposed by it? A major issue was that these set of reforms led to the politicization of bureaucracy, right? Which means is that it basically sort of reduced or sort of cut down or got rid of this separation of politics and administration. Remember the dichotomy between politics and administration, which was proposed by Wilson. So that was sort of this dichotomy was taken away as a result of these set of reforms, and now your politicians actually interfere too much in the work of civil services, right? And this political interference came in the form of sort of frequent postings or sort of deciding frequent transfers of civil services, and sort of the result or the immediate consequence of too much political interference is that it undermines the institutional integrity of the civil service, that civil services or civil servants no longer can make decisions on their own or without fear of sort of getting any or facing any repercussions from the politicians, right? Another sort of disadvantage or a con associated with some of the reforms proposed by this committee was that it took away the constitutionally granted security of service, which I was just mentioning, and it sort of encouraged a dismissal of civil servants without actually following due legal process. Right? What is the due legal process? It simply means that you're ensuring that whoever is dismissed should be dismissed on the basis of merit or on the basis of fair treatment, rather than just arbitrarily or rather than arbitrarily dismissed by the politicians because they feel that the civil servants are not giving in to their demands, right? So this is just some sort of short analysis, brief analysis of some of the reforms which were proposed by this committee. Now let's move on to these reforms which were proposed under this National Commission for Government Reforms. So this particular committee was formed in April 2006 during President Musharraf's time period, and the person who was leading this particular committee was Dr. Ishrat Hussain, who was the former sort of president of State Bank of Pakistan, and currently, if you follow the news, he is the advisor on reforms and austerity measures to the Prime Minister Imran Khan in the current government as well. So, this National Commission for Government Reforms actually presented a comprehensive reform on administrative reforms across the different levels of government. And just to let you guys know, this particular commission didn't just propose reforms for the civil services, but rather it proposed reforms for the entire administrative apparatus, or sort of entire district management system as well of the country. And it proposed these reforms across different levels of the government, maybe federal government, provincial government, or local government, right? So again, this was like a very comprehensive set of reforms. For the purpose of this lecture, we are only going to be talking about reforms which were proposed for the civil services, right? So it basically proposed that there needs to be an open and transparent merit-based recruitment system in the civil services. This committee also emphasized that there needs to be performance-based promotions, right? You should be promoted on the basis of merit, on the basis of your sort of accomplishments in the civil services, right? Another sort of reform which was proposed was that there needs to be career progression for all public sector employees, and it basically proposed compulsory training at post induction, mid career, and senior management levels. Basically, it wanted to propose a complete overhaul of the way trainings are conducted in your civil services, and these set of reforms actually sort of encourage or propose greater specialized knowledge imparted to the civil servants as opposed to just generalized knowledge provided to them. Another key feature which was proposed by this committee was the restructuring of occupation groups. It totally sort of proposed the revamping of the occupation groups like Pakistan Administrative Services, Foreign Services, etc. And again, for the purpose of this lecture, we are not going to go through this restructuring in detail. If you are keen to know more about it, just Google this National Commission for Government Reforms and see what has been some of the changes which were proposed. Now, in terms of the status of implementation of these set of reforms, unfortunately, these reforms never got implemented, right? And it's such a pity that this committee spent like years sort of first of all analyzing your civil services, and then after the analysis of your public sector employment, they then proposed the set of reforms, right? It took them a lot of time and effort as well, and all that effort unfortunately sort of went in vain because these reforms actually never got executed, never got implemented. And this has been sort of the fate of a lot of other reforms efforts in the case of Pakistan as well, right? So let's move on. So, in this section of the lecture, we are going to discuss some of the decentralization reforms. Actually, we're just going to discuss one of the reforms, and just to sort of help you guys revise what decentralization is, decentralization essentially means sort of empowering the local government or the lower level of your civil services, right? So let's discuss some of the decentralization reforms in Pakistan. So Before we actually discuss some of the reforms, I just want to sort of tell you the irony of Pakistan's local government reforms. Local government reforms, which essentially represent that you're deepening democracy, right? What do we mean by democracy? We mean that we are ensuring greater participation of the people at the ground levels, right? We are ensuring people at the lower levels, at the community level, or taking part in the way governance is being done in the country, right? So, local government reforms should be around the world, should be and are actually an hallmark of democratic governments, right? However, in the case of Pakistan, the irony or the paradox is that these reforms, rather than being implemented by civilian democratic governments, they were actually proposed and implemented by military dictatorships, right? And in fact, some of these reforms, if they were sort of proposed by the democratic regimes, they were either rolled back or altogether neglected. Some of Pakistan's most important local government reforms were introduced by General Ayub Khan, General Ziaul Haq, and then later on in 2000s by General Pervez Musharraf. So, for the purpose of this lecture, we'll only go through the local government reforms proposed by General Musharraf because they actually had a widespread impact on the way local governments were implemented in Pakistan. So let's go through these. So, during President Musharraf's time period, we had this devolution plan of the year 2000, and this plan was actually drafted as a result of these national reconstruction efforts, which were led by the National Reconstruction Bureau. And these reforms actually presented the most sweeping reforms introduced in the history of Pakistan since 1973, right? 1973 was the year in which our constitution was passed. And according to this devolution plan, the main aim of launching this plan was to actually increase the number of elected politicians in terms of articulating community goals. So the role was that you are actually empowering the grassroots level, or you are ensuring that your communities, local governments are empowered. Another official goal was to actually provide autonomy to the district governments in terms of the administration of various districts. And the last sort of sweeping power, which hadn't been provided to the districts of Pakistan prior to these set of reform initiatives, was that the devolution plan actually provided taxation powers to the districts as well, right? Now, in theory and on paper, all of these goals I think look really good, and interestingly, they're in line with the democratic ideals of governance, right? Because I told you that in democracies, the idea is that you want to empower the grassroots level, you want the communities to make decisions, you want them to participate in the electoral process, right? But the irony, as I was mentioning previously, was this is actually implemented by a military dictator. And part of the reason, just to tell you the flip side of these official goals as well, one of the main reasons why, elected politicians at the local level were to be sort of empowered, one of the main reasons was because you were bypassing the provincial level. So during Musharraf's time period, provinces were not given autonomy. There was supposed to be no political activity at the provincial level, right? So, what essentially President Musharraf's government was trying to do was that the center was absolutely strong because you had a autocratic ruler at the center, and you bypass the provincial level and you are actually empowering the local level or the government, the community level, because you want to keep the people happy so that they do not voice their concerns against an autocratic rule, right? So those are, I mean, if you read behind the lines, those are the real aims why you wanted to empower the community at the grassroots level. So what happened in the devolution plan of 2000? So the most, you can say, radical change which was proposed by this devolution plan was that it sort of, you can say, disempowered the bureaucracy. It took away powers from bureaucrats. How? by actually abolishing the post of commissioner, deputy commissioner, assistant commissioner, right? So these were all the posts which are held by an officer of Pakistan Administrative Services, PAS. And all of these powers, and please bear this in mind that these are unelected officials, right? Bureaucracy is not elected. And all of these powers were actually transferred to people who are elected at the district level, tehsil level, and union levels, right? So at the local level, you basically had elected officials, and all the decision making or all the policy making at the local level was actually done by elected officials as opposed to the bureaucracy, right? And another change was that this office of the deputy commissioner was actually sort of redesigned, or you can say changed a little or went through a makeover, and it was actually called now a district coordination officer, right? So this guy who was a DCO was a bureaucrat. However, unlike normal times or unlike previous times, a DCO was actually below or he had to report to an elected official, a Nazim, as opposed to the case which is even presently. So, what is the present scenario? That your bureaucracy is actually strong. You still have the office of the deputy commissioner, and your local government or your Nazims, for example, come sort of or do not have as much say as a district commissioner, right? So this power or this authority, which was historically with the office of the deputy commissioner, was taken away, and this office was remodeled to a district coordination officer, whereby the person holding this particular task or designation would assist your Zilla Nazim, who is a district Nazim, an elected official, as well as coordinate all the like sort of working of district officers who were sort of heading various administrative departments like health department, education department in that particular vicinity, right? So the idea was that your DCO, this district coordination officer, was the administrative head of the district, the principal accounting officer related to all the revenue generation or in terms of holding the accounts of that particular district, and he was the implementing sort of agent of the district budget as well, right? However, all the policy making was actually happening at the Nazim level, right? So the district coordination officer was only an implementation agent rather than a policy maker, and your nazims who are an elected who represent an elected body were actually formulating all the policies and sort of dictating to the DCOs that do this and do that, carry out this particular task, and etc., right? So this was like a major change because through these reforms, you had sort of taken away a massive power from your bureaucracy, right? Because historically, at the district level, your DC, who is the deputy commissioner, makes the policies as well as administers the policies as well. However, this devolution plan of 2000 changed this power play between the district, the deputy commissioner, and the Nazim. So moving on, just to tell you guys about the status of this devolution plan. So this local government system actually worked for over 10 years under the special legislation which was passed through a constitutional amendment, right? So this was during the time of President Musharraf. And however, after the passage of 10 years, this particular constitutional amendment or the system was going to be expired, right? And it was not going to be sort of renewed until and unless a further amendment to the constitution was made, right? So we know that in 2008, President Musharraf's government was toppled and we had the civilian government in place. And naturally, why would a civilian government, put in place a local government system which was designed during a dictator's time period, right? So you can just say that after Musharraf's time period, right away, in 2008, fresh round elections for local governments were not really held, and these councils and Nazims were actually gradually phased out, right? So you might actually ask, what is the scenario of local government systems now? Because it's been almost a decade that this particular devolution plan expired. So currently, unfortunately, we do not have a very well established local government systems because a lot of time has been spent by provinces in terms of just legislating and sort of drafting policies related to how the local government system should look like, right? So provinces have spent a lot of time just figuring out how this system should function. And in the past couple of years, your Supreme Court has actually, your high courts in various provinces have actually taken action that this local government system has not been adequately sort of implemented in different provinces. So some provinces have been relatively successful, you may say, others not so, right? So even during PTI's government's tenure, they have PTI. You currently know that that they have power or authority, or they have a government currently in Punjab and KPK. However, they're still figuring out how to actually empower or devolve power at the local government system. So I'll stop here. So I've only sort of shown you some of the reform efforts that have been put in place in Pakistan, and I've only gone through some selective reforms. So there are some other reforms as well, but for the purpose of our lecture, I think we'll skip those. So in terms of just summing up with this lecture, so numerous efforts, as you guys must have understood or realize that numerous efforts have been undertaken during the history of Pakistan to revamp the civil services, to sort of fix the decentralization mechanisms or local government mechanisms as well, right? Apart from these reforms that I have mentioned, there were some other reforms related to accountability as well. For example, the creation of NAB is considered another major reform effort as well. So, in terms of the results of these reforms, so you can say there were a bit of a mixed results of reform. So, as I mentioned earlier in the lecture, some of these reforms were not sort of implemented at all. Others were implemented to some extent. Some of them were implemented for a short period of time, but then rolled back by successive governments, right? And some of the reasons why there has been this lack of success in terms of a reforms efforts is that there has been lack of consistency in terms of implementing reforms. So one government would come up with one set of reforms, the other would sort of roll those back and come up with altogether new reforms, right? Just to undermine the credibility of the previous government. Similarly, corruption has been a major issue that has gripped our country, and due to this prevalence of corruption, there have been a lot of sort of actors which are resisting genuine reform efforts in the case of Pakistan. So, simply saying, I mean, we still have a long way to go. We still need to reform our administrative systems quite a lot in order to make them up to the mark, in order to truly, provide efficient and effective services for our citizens. So that's all for this week. So this basically concludes our lecture on administrative reforms. I'll see you guys next week with a new lecture.